Okay, we're live now. Hi, everybody.
Good morning.
Let's see. Merlin's going to be answering your bat house questions. Bat B&B. Let's wait for them to join. I'm Teresa. This is Merlin. Yay. Hi, and that's Jessica.
Hello.
Hello. All right.
Hi, Merlin.
Hi, Jessica.
How are you?
I'm just fine.
I'm so excited to talk to you today. We've been getting inundated with questions at Bat B&B, and I know there's no one better to answer some of these questions than you. So, do you mind if we dive right into some questions?
That'll be just fine.
Excellent. So, as you can imagine, a lot of the questions we get are around bat houses. Can you tell us a little bit about your history and how you got into looking at bat houses?
Well, first of all, in my 60-some years of fieldwork studying bats, I've time and time again seen evidence that roost shortages are the single most limiting factor for most American bats. They used to have ancient tree hollows. Lots of the old trees they were huge. 5 men could walk in and stand and look up in the hollow inside one tree.
Yeah.
And there are all kinds of places for bats to roost in these ancient forests. But today, those forests are nearly entirely gone. And so bats are left to either die without a place to live or try to live in people's attics, which often gets them killed.
Right.
And bat houses can be very helpful in providing for those bats, not only for providing for those bats, but also for educating people to overcome their needless fears of bats.
And when was that you got into it?
I first introduced bats into America in about 1982.
Wow. Okay.
And
And
we've
over
learned
that,
since then.
and over all that time, Merlin, what are you finding are the qualities people should look for in a bat house? What do bat houses need to be successful?
They, first of all, for most U.S. bats, need to have crevice widths for bats to roost in that are 3/4 of an inch to an inch wide. There are special circumstances if you're trying to attract Florida bonded bats or pallid bats, you might go up to an inch and a half. But for most American bats, if you don't have a narrow enough crevice, the bats aren't likely to use it. Part of that is about self-protection from predators. If your little bat in a 3/4 inch wide crevice, if a snake tries to come in to eat you, you just open your mouth and he can't do anything but get his nose bit. He can't grab you. So I think that has a lot to do with bats wanting narrow crevices to roost in. Another thing, the house has to be tall enough to provide a thermal gradient. Houses that are less than a couple feet tall are very unlikely to provide sufficient thermal gradient. It also helps to have them properly caulked and painted so that they last a long time. In the past, there's been a lot of discussion about painting bat houses. Did paint repel bats or did it help get them sooner? But we have tests going on right now, which I think pretty much put an end to that argument. We put up pairs of houses that are identical, except for one's painted, one's not painted. And we put them up on the same day so that they are absolutely comparable.
Yeah.
And
Where did you do that?
right here in Hill Country. And
Texas. We're in Texas. There's people in here from all over the world. Merlin, you gotta
Okay.
say where you're
Okay.
at.
At any rate, there's no question that the bats moved into the painted houses first, despite the fact that the painted houses had only fairly recently been painted and put up. They are occupying both painted and unpainted houses, so it's not like we found the paint was mandatory, but we found the paint didn't repel, as some people thought it might. And the paint does greatly extend the life of the house, especially if you have 2 or 3 coats of paint.
Yeah, we usually recommend different colors based on region in terms of retaining some heat. Can you speak to a lot of people have been worried about the higher temperatures this summer around bat houses?
Good. That's something you should be worried about. And color is important. And unfortunately, I'm going to have to say you could use almost any color almost anywhere depending on how much sun you expose it to. I suspect you could use a black house just fine down here in the heat of Texas as long as it was completely shaded. But
Okay.
what we're finding is that it appears that most bats like to have some sun on their houses. And so we now here in this part of Texas where we have rather extreme temperatures, we've had bats moving into new houses in the last 2 weeks when the temperatures are 109 degrees and the houses are exposed to full sun. So that tells us very interestingly that our houses are temperature wise not a the bats can withstand high heat in them. The houses we're using now are just natural wood color, even if we paint them. And we're not, we also have metal roofs on them with a slight overhang. That can extend the life of a bat house and cast shadows down midday that help keep it from overheating. But mostly the things we're doing are venting the houses. Houses, especially in hot climates, must be vented so that the heat doesn't get all the way to the bottom.
Yeah, and I know you helped us design where the ventilation for our bat houses goes, and I know that the size is really great for temperature gradient. Can you tell us, like, what is the ideal size? I think when we say big, I think some people are surprised, like for bat B&B, they're always surprised how large the bat house actually is.
Well, the one thing that I have to emphasize is there is no explanation, there is no house where one fits all. Depends on what species you're trying to attract, where you live, the temperature and climate there. But there are guidelines, and I will be very happy to see our new book come out in October, which will answer a lot of these questions so that I don't have to spend so much time answering them myself. But I think you could have a fairly dark bat house in full shade even here in the hot heat of Texas. But what I'm preferring is about a natural wood color with good venting. And one thing you need to know is you could make a bat house theoretically 10 feet tall and it wouldn't hold any more bats than a bat house that was 2 feet tall. Because you can imagine nobody wants to live where he's being pooped on all day by somebody up above.
Right.
So the way you can figure how many bats can live in your bat house is, on average, roughly 20 to 22 bats of most of our U.S. species can roost in a horizontal foot of roosting space. So if you have 2 feet of open crevice at the bottom, then you have room for 42 to 44 bats. My math isn't great.
Mine either. So are
And,
those the things that you're looking for when you give your, oh, sorry, go ahead.
but let me point out that height of the house, although it doesn't mean you can house more bats, it's very important to temperature. On a cool day, they may like to go up in the top where it's much warmer. On a hot day, they'll come down below the vent.
Okay, that makes sense. Yeah. So those are the things that when you give your seal of approval on a bat house, like we were so honored to get to work with you in designing and to get your seal of approval on design. Those are the things you're looking for: ventilation, the size, the narrowness of the chambers.
Yes, but there are also more that I unfortunately didn't yet get around to pointing out. Houses with landing pads have been demonstrated to do much better. Bats like to have a rough surface that they can land and cling to just as they're going to climb up into the house. And you need roughened surfaces in the house so that the bats can cling to the dividers really well and the young don't fall out. I'm sure there's something else. Teresa, what else have I left out?
I don't know, but you can look on our website.
Right.
And the book when it comes out, of course.
Having them well caulked and painted is certainly, or at least sealed, is a very good idea to make them last longer.
Mm-hmm.
A lot of this is on our website. I'll just, for people that are, I see people questions popping in. I'll just pull this up behind Merlin if you guys can see. We have this bat house section on our resource page, and selecting a quality bat house is the first one. And that's where we have like the general info and information about our seal of approval that you know, we gave to Bat B&B and a few others. There's lots of the basic information here, and then lots more information in the book coming out.
Yeah, one of the problems I see with a lot of bat house vendors is that they either they don't know very much about where bat houses should be placed or how they should be oriented, or they just don't provide it. You shouldn't buy a bat house that doesn't have good instructions, and you know, don't fall for this idea that, for example, you can just plant night blooming flowers in your yard and you'll attract more bats. Those kinds of things, they've gotten into a lot of instructions and they don't really mean anything. Bats are going to feed wherever the insect pests are, but like if you're wanting a bat that's going to eat more mosquitoes, you don't want to attract one that's going to eat more sphinx moths that come to night blooming flowers. It's not, they're not the right bat. But we will have thorough instructions. You know, it's important to get them high enough above ground. A lot of bats will go into a bat house that's 10 or 12 feet above ground, but like the free-tailed bats, the ones that most often use houses here in the South, 12 feet is probably the minimum height above ground for them, and we often put our houses 20 or even 25 feet above ground.
Yeah. Oh, you mentioned the free-tailed bats. What species are more likely to use a bat house, do you think?
Depends on where you live. There are free-tailed bats are the number one suspects when bats have moved into a house down here, and I haven't seen and identified them yet. But we also have a lot of evening bats and some cave myotis. As you go farther north, you get big brown bats and little brown bats. Even endangered Indiana bats have been known to live in bat houses. Threatened northern long-eared bats have been known to live in bat houses. Unfortunately, a lot of those bats have had dramatic population declines in recent years because of white nose syndrome, a fungus that attacks them during hibernation.
Interesting. I'm wondering, a lot of times we get asked for these bats how close a water source should be for a bat house. And they can travel long distances in a night, right? So what would you recommend for a water source?
Well, I would strongly, I mean, I can't tell you won't, you know, watch out for experts that can tell you absolutes because there just aren't any.
Yeah.
As soon as I tell somebody that something is almost certain to happen, that's what doesn't happen.
I feel like this is a good question too. I see people asking about, like, I live in an apartment building, or like, can I put it in my neighborhood? And maybe they don't live on a ranch with a creek or a pond or something.
Well, basically what I tell people is the closer you live to a natural waterway, a year-round river preferably, where you have riparian, that's habitat. Rivers normally have a lot of plant diversity, and plant diversity breeds insect diversity. And it's not so much the bats, I see instructions for bat houses that you want to be sure they have a bird bath or something to drink out of, that's not relevant. They do like a water source where they can drink, but the main reason for liking rivers, to be near rivers or streams or lakes, is that they like the diversity and reliability of insects from these places.
Mm.
And for example, there was a study done in the Mediterranean where they put up bat houses strategically located near rice paddies. And they found that over a period of several years, they were able to attract enough bats to end the need for pesticides to control moths that attack the rice.
Mm-hmm.
But what they pointed out was that experiment would have failed had those rice paddies been a long ways from the nearest natural habitat. There was a national park not far away, and the bats could go there to feed when the pest insects weren't available after the crops had been harvested.
Sure.
So biodiversity is a big thing. The more diverse the habitat around where you live, the more likely you are to attract bats to a bat house. And having a river or a lake nearby is an indication of the biodiversity. Free-tailed bats are especially good at dealing with what we call monocultures, or their vast areas planted in cotton or corn or just housing, because they can fly up hundreds or thousands of feet above ground and catch tailwinds and travel at nearly 100 miles an hour. So what's a monoculture for one animal is a diverse habitat for, say, a free-tailed bat that can cover a lot of area.
Right. Well, do you think that much noise around bats in a bat house during the day? Is there much commotion that can? That's okay.
It depends on the kind of commotion. I'll tell you an interesting experience. It illustrates a couple things. It happened just this week. A person that I'm working with to test bat houses has 2 sets of eight houses on in an orchard of his, and one of the houses had in about 4 months become well occupied by bats. He was very happy about that, and we're looking to see what the bats prefer. So we put pairs of houses with different treatments, and I asked him to put something on the ground so that he could count the amount of guano that fell. And if you put up 2 houses and you don't notice anything for a few weeks, and then you find bats in both of them, you you don't know which one or if they preferred one of them.
Okay.
But if you put something on the ground where you can actually count the droppings, and you come out and one day there's 10 droppings and a week later there's 20 or 30 and it goes on, there may be a house right by it that only gets droppings after the first one fills up.
Okay.
Well, that would tell you something. It tells you that the first one, whatever that treatment was the one that they really preferred, and the second one is one that they will accept if they have to. And so anyway, he went out, and I told him to gather up the guano each time he checked so that he'd know how much had fallen since the last check. He took a broom out, and he went to sweep up the guano. He had quite a bit of it under one of the houses, used the broom, and I'd never had this experience before, but just from what happened, I can assure you that broom must have created a lot of ultrasound. And immediately the bats bailed out of his house. Fortunately, he had them in groups of 4, so they just flew to the nearest house 20 feet away and went in that real quick. But then apparently that night they decided that they didn't like to be where they had that much of a fright nearby, so they completely left the area. But he didn't lose his bats because they went to his other batch of houses on the other end of the orchard. And this does illustrate another thing. We have found time and again that you're more than twice as likely to be successful attracting bats if you put up 2 or more houses in the same general area. They are used to living in snags that, under tree bark in snags or in cavities. They blow down in storms. And so bats instinctively want to know where they're going to go in an emergency if something goes wrong. So this may explain why, I no longer ever encourage anybody to put up a really big bat house to start with.
Okay.
What is really big? What do you mean by that?
Well,
what's the size?
I'm talking about one that would hold thousands.
Like the barns.
Well, not the Florida bat barns are like 16, 18 feet. I'm not talking about that big, but any fairly large house. I would start with relatively simple small houses, at least 2 or 3 of them in an area. And the bats, if they move into those, then you can go ever larger. But I think what happens a lot of times when you put up just one house, even though it may be large, the bats view that as one roost that could fall down in the next storm. And that doesn't give them any reassurance of where they're going to go next if something happens. So start with multiple houses, small, relatively. I mean, when I say small, anywhere from 1 chamber to 4 chamber, but I actually now advocate putting up even 1 chamber houses, 1 in more sun, 1 in less, and 1 in the shade. That gives bats choices. When a heat wave comes along, for example, I know of a case where a person put up a bat house in the shade and he never got any bats in it. 10 years, he never had any bats in it. But he had a house in the full sun that had a nursery colony of big brown bats in it every year. But we had a suddenly very hot year. And in that very hot year, he probably would have lost his colony, except they moved to the house in the shade that had never been used in 10 years.
Wow.
He kept it up.
So bats are looking at this as an insurance policy, and you should too.
That's great advice. We often have people reaching out saying they've had a bat house up for quite some time and wondering what they can do. So that's good to know. Put up more options for them and see if maybe they don't like the spot and see what works best for them. That's great.
Let me point out that the best known bat house users I'm aware of in America, very often they start out failing. they would put up a house that had, you know, was too dark colored for the amount of sun it was getting at that location, or, you know, various reasons they weren't successful. But they didn't give up. And they either moved the first house, like if the first house was just one in the full sun and it didn't get anything, try moving it to where it only gets a half day of sun or less. But they each experimented, and some of those people that failed at first now have 40,000 bats in their houses.
That's incredible.
How long does it usually take?
Yeah, everybody wants to know how long it takes to get bats. I show a picture on our website of a bat house that was fully occupied, 100 bats in a week.
Wow.
But here's one of the problems. That can prove very misleading. If, in fact, those bats were desperate, that house might not be a very good house, but still be successful in the first week.
Okay.
But so it really helps to give bats choices. And when we give them darker versus lighter houses, more ventilated versus less ventilated, more sun versus less sun, these things all make a difference. And by giving bats choices of several different ones at first, instead of just investing in a big one, saying, okay, I'm going to up my odds because bats like big houses. They may like big houses, but big houses have a pretty poor track record at being able to track bats when it's just one big house. So put up a number of houses done in different exposures, different colors, different whatever. Give the bats a choice, and you will probably, they'll tell you what they want.
I think we can relate so much to that. We all love to have options.
Right.
What about, I mean, I'm thinking about some people like thinking it might kind of sound overwhelming. Like, okay, so I have to spend like a lot of money and put up like 3 or 4 bat houses. I don't have that much space, or like, what would you recommend for someone that still wants to help and maybe doesn't have those kinds of resources or space?
Yeah.
Well, you can always help someone else.
Like in your neighborhood, or
you know,
something with your park?
maybe some neighbors partner, and each one buys 2 bat houses, so you have 4 to let the bats choose among.
That's a good conversation starter too.
Well, bat houses are absolutely superb at educating the public about the values of living in harmony with nature. I just this week, a pecan grower here in Texas who put up bat houses last fall, he just noticed 55 bats coming out of one of his houses, and believe me, he was so excited he could hardly talk to me on the phone. It's amazing, you know. Even if you have 10 or 20 bats coming out of a bat house, it puts on a nice show at dusk, and people very much enjoy watching the bats come out and seeing them go after local insects.
And you know, Merlin, something that we've been hearing a lot about recently is people using some of their at-home small security cameras to kind of put them on the outside of the bat house to monitor any movement. I'm wondering what your thoughts are on this, and if you think any infrared lights would bother them. Not
infrared lights, but just be sure that whatever you're using doesn't produce ultrasound. You know, sometimes, you know, like sweeping of that broom, that wouldn't have occurred even to me that was a problem. Yeah. But I guarantee you now that he had the problem, if I took my bat detector out there and turned it on, I would hear a lot of, probably not just ultrasound, but see, that's the worst thing for a bat is random intense sound from low to high frequency.
Okay.
I was in an auditorium one night trying to demonstrate bat echolocation to an audience, and I had checked everything and it worked perfectly before I got up to talk. when I got a talk, I was going to let them hear in the sound system the bad echolocate, but they had turned on spotlights on the stage to illuminate the speaker, and those spotlights were producing huge amounts of ultrasound, and it screwed my whole opportunity. I hadn't anticipated that the lights were going to make all that ultrasound.
Wow.
Yeah, that's good to know what to be aware of in your surroundings then that is also making lots of noise. And that's a great way to use the bat detector, even if there's not bats around. Listen to what's making sound that could impact them.
Yeah, and don't put your house too near a yard light. You know, the light just illuminates things so that owls can catch them a lot easier, and they know that, and they try to avoid well-lit places. I mean, don't get me wrong, everybody has seen bats catching insects around a light. That's a bit different than having to land to get in and out of your bat house with a light shine on it.
That's a good point. And that's one of the biggest recommendations against putting a bat house on a tree. Is that correct? Just having branches and perches for predators and providing too much shade?
Bat houses can be put on trees, but I wouldn't personally even think about putting a bat house on a tree unless it's like a southern pine where you have a very long trunk and then the branches well up above. Any tree like our live oaks around here, I would only put a house on one as an extreme last resort of desperation. What we know, we can't say, you know, it's inappropriate to say bats won't live in houses on trees. They will. But the odds of success are about 75% less than if you'd put the same house on a nearby building or a pole. Now, if you live in a cold climate, in the most northern or high elevation climates where it's the coldest, houses rarely succeed unless they're mounted on buildings. The buildings act as thermal heat sinks and keep the houses from getting too cold for the pups at night.
Yeah.
And do the same rules apply for putting on a building? Like you want it to be how far away from wires or branches or stuff like that?
Your preference is to not have owl perches or hawk perches too close. What we've seen here in these tests we've been doing, the guy who has 55 bats in his house very quickly, he put up two houses. One is 50 feet roughly from the nearest trees, and the other one is maybe 300 or 400 feet away. I kind of intuitively predicted that the one 50 feet from trees would be occupied first, and it was. Some bats like to fly directly into tree canopy to escape predators, and some try to avoid tree canopy to escape predators. This is because it's the highly maneuverable ones that use the canopy to avoid predators, and the very swift, fast-flying ones like the free-tailed bats, they just want to get up and get at high speed, and then they can't be caught anymore, or aren't. There's no such thing as not being able to be caught anymore, but it takes a fairly enterprised and experienced hawk to do it.
Oh, we lost Jessica. I assume she'll pop back on. Let me send another invite. Here we go.
I don't know how much we lost.
No, we're still on.
Oh, sorry about that.
Is it possible to help bats find the houses? That's okay. I just went to the questions.
Not that we know of. People sometimes, forget about these. There's one out there, Uncle Somebody's bat lure. Those kind of things. You paint bat houses with bat feces or things like that, there's no evidence that it helps. You might potentially even repel some bats, because if you're putting up scent of a bat species that doesn't get along with another species, the other species might not want to move in there.
That's kind of like, I saw a thing where it was like, it's kind of rude to use bird calls in your yard if you don't know exactly what bird call, because you might be talking shit to somebody you don't know about.
Yeah.
So no, there's no real way to attract bats, or no proven way.
Bats, in my experience, typically bats find a house, if it's a good house, properly located, they find it usually within 12 to 18 months. And then they'll build. Sometimes the whole bunch will just come at once, and sometimes they'll build gradually. But that all depends on local circumstances. Like I say, you might have them move in practically overnight, but don't assume that they love that house just because they moved in quickly. Until you've given them some options, you're not sure whether they're desperate or in love with your house. Sometimes people put up a house that is very marginal, but quickly heavily used because of desperate bats, and then they go to making more and sell them or giving them their friends, saying, oh, this is a proven bad house. It's not a proven bad house. It may never work again. Even the worst bad house ever made may work if you put it in a place where bats are desperate enough.
Something you said just a second ago, Merlin, made me wonder, have you ever seen more than one species occupy a bat house together?
Absolutely. In the northern areas, big brown bats will tend to use the widest crevice widths toward the back of a house, and little brown bats the narrowest toward the front of the house. And I say widest and narrowest. Up to big browns probably use pretty regularly anything from 3/4 to 1 1/4 inch, and they might actually prefer 1 inch to 1 1/4 inch. But if I were going to build a house with varied spaces and I was in the northern US or Canada, I would have my 3/4 inch partitions or spaces toward the front, and if I was going to put a wider one, I'd have it in the back, because the big brown bats seem not only to like a slightly wider roost space, but they also are seeking cooler roosts, and the back part of the house doesn't heat up as much as the front.
Mm-hmm.
And one point, whereas we used to have little brown bats used to be the dominant bats that you would try to attract in the upper half of North America, they have crashed big time from the fungal invasion. So now you may be oftentimes more looking at attracting big brown bats that haven't been as affected by the fungus.
Interesting. You mentioned you're working on monitoring some bat houses. You have a guide coming out in October. What other projects are you working on right now?
We're working on a whole bunch. I just spent day before yesterday out with more than 100 pecan growers at an annual pecan growers conference, and we were out in pecan orchards looking at experiments. We have 16 houses out that we're experimenting with right now, and like I said earlier, one of the experiments was to see how they responded to paint, and we've answered that. We know that they certainly aren't repelled by paint, and may like painted houses even better, but we've got more data to collect to know that. But the rocket boxes were selected before they went into the 3-chamber, more traditional type houses. But where only the traditional type houses were put up, they occupied those just as quickly as they did the rocket boxes where they chose rocket boxes. So we haven't seen a major difference between the flat, wider boxes and the rocket boxes. Rocket boxes tend to get bats sooner, and they're very successful, but they also tend not to hold as many bats.
Okay.
Workshop?
Oh, we have a workshop coming up here in the San Marcos area of Texas in September, where the first night we'll take everybody out to watch the fabulous emergence at Bracken Cave and talk about how the bats from that one cave can consume 100 to 200 tons of insects in a single night. And we'll kind of have an introduction to freetails and their needs. And then for the next couple of days, we'll have lectures by me and by expert pecan growers on both the local bats and how to attract them to orchards. We'll go out in the evenings and net and record bats. We did this last April, and of the 8 species we thought might be in Troy Swift's orchard, we caught or recorded the echolocation sounds of 6. And so that'll all be real interesting stuff. We set up a laptop monitor where you can actually, as bats fly over, you can identify which species it is, and whether they're chasing an insect or just passing by watching the monitor. So we have a lot of things. There'll be a bat house demonstration where all the pieces are kind of already pre-cut, but we'll have an explanation putting them together and talking about how best to do it. So, anybody listening that can get here, would be delighted to encourage more participation, but we'll have to limit it to 20 or 25 people. So if you really want to come, it would be a good idea to get let us know fairly soon. This should be up advertised very shortly on our website.
I would say probably today or tomorrow.
Yeah.
That's exciting.
I'll put links on our Instagram bio as well for Bat House, everything Bat House on our website.
Excellent. Teresa, did we miss any questions?
I saw some coming through. I feel like we pretty much covered it. Any advice on artificial caves? Woo!
I did design an artificial cave out at the Bamberger Ranch
in Texas.
Here in Texas. And it does have a reported 500,000 bats in it now. That's tricky, and I wouldn't suggest anybody trying it without getting some very serious advice. And be careful who you get the advice from, because there's almost nobody has real experience with that.
We're getting advice from you right now, though.
and let me tell you that I'm myself very cautious about advising somebody how to build an artificial cave, because I know it's going to cost them a small fortune, and I don't want the rap when it doesn't work. Even with bat houses, we, for example, put up 4 test houses. They're all identical in Florida several years ago. 3 of them attracted at least 1,000 or more bats within 12 to 18 months. The 4th one, for unknown reasons, is still empty years later. They're all identical. So it really pays to do a little experimenting to see what bats need and what, if you get a lot of bats moving into bat houses, then there might be justification to try and do a cave, but only certain species are going to use a cave, and some only use it to hibernate, which may do them a lot of good, but not you a lot of interest, because you don't get to see emergences as you would like during the summer. But you can build artificial caves, and artificial large roofs are possible, and I'm happy to consult on them. I just warn people in advance that although we've learned an awful lot, we still can't give you any certainty as to whether bats are going to move in or not.
I saw another question come through here, Merlin, wondering what kind of detector you're using.
Acoustic detector. Acoustic detector?
Yeah.
Wildlife acoustics?
Yeah, we're using wildlife acoustics detectors.
Perfect.
They have very good detectors.
Yes. And I know they have some more professional options and then some for just anybody to use on their tablet. So that makes it easy for just anyone to be listening to bats.
Right. Basically, even I don't usually put a lot of trust in my ability to identify each species. If you know the bats of an area quite well, you can do a pretty good job of identifying the species. That's assuming you don't live in, let's say, Central America. If you live in a place where there's, 30 or more species of bats, it's going to be pretty hard, because a lot of those have never been recorded sufficiently to even put them in software to be identified. But I love going out with my bat detector and listening to free-tailed bats and other species, and I can easily tell when I got different species, and I can easily tell when they're approaching an obstacle or chasing an insect. Or they're a lot of fun to use, even if you don't trust knowing exactly which species you're listening to. These detectors will usually show you two species if you ask what species you're listening to. And I was the one that advised that.
Okay.
They show you it's most likely to be one of these two species. You can usually get it pretty close that way, and it's fun to know it's probably one of two. And like, actually, hoary bats, we thought they were pretty rare around here, and only here in migration or overwintering, but I've been surprised how many times experts who really know how to use their detectors are picking up hoary bats here apparently year round.
Well, Merlin, maybe we can wrap up with this, but I just saw this question coming through talking about the conservation of bats. What do you think is most important moving forward in the conservation for bats?
It depends on where you are and what species you're trying to conserve, when you get down to details. But the single most important problem for bats these days is just outrageously exaggerated claims of disease. These, you hear, stay away from bats. They could give you, they could fly over and poop on you and give you Ebola. There's not a shred of evidence to support that kind of speculation. There's not evidence that a bat has ever flown over anybody and pooped on them and given them a disease. And there's, and this sneaky little bat's biting you in your sleep without your knowing it. That's an exceedingly rare event, if indeed it ever occurs.
So putting fears in perspective.
Right. So what we want to do is warn people, just don't pick up bats that are out exposed where if a bat's out where you can pick it up in the daytime, it's almost certainly sick. Leave it alone. Don't take a chance. But for anybody who doesn't just go out and pick up a bat, get bitten, and then do nothing about it, the odds of any kind of harm from a bat are incredibly remote.
Absolutely. And that's another great resource page that you have on your website too, talking about bats and diseases. I utilize that a lot because we get a lot of questions about that and bringing bats to your yard.
Well, one thing I'd like to point out is that bats need a lot of education. People rarely help and often kill what they fear.
You mean humans need a lot of education?
Yeah, I'm sorry. We really need to be educating our friends and neighbors about bats. That's the bottom line, is people begin to understand the importance of bats. I mean, bats are worth an estimated nearly $23 billion a summer in just agricultural protection in the United States. And every time we lose another bat, we just become that more addicted to toxic chemical pesticides that are already threatening every aspect of our lives and environment. And we operate strictly based on memberships, and we really appreciate when people join us and keep up to date on what bat, one of our next projects is to go to Kasonka, Africa, and help in the protection of the world's largest remaining flying fox colony. 8 to 10 million flying foxes. It's going to be an incredible experience for people who go and see these bats emerging in the evening. But while we're there, we're also going to make a film of the bats and do publicity work that the national park there can use to convince the government that has thus far too often ignored the bats' plight to do something to protect them. There are all kinds of problems. There's a industrial agricultural company that wants to divert 90% of the national park's water, which would be devastating to the bats and other wildlife. There's a game park that wants to cut thousands of hectares of forest the bats need to feed. There's a wind turbine site wanting to be built where they'd be killing bats flying by. We work very hard to keep our members informed of what the needs of bats are and how they can help. And people actually come on our workshops, not just a bat workshop, the bat house workshop for a couple nights, but people from all over the world join our workshops in places like this next one that's coming up in November in Kasonka, Zambia. But we have workshops in South America and Caribbean and other places too. We're very happy to welcome new members. It all adds up to making a very big difference for bats.
That's really great. And all the information is on your website too about the trip in November?
Yes.
Excellent. That's really exciting.
Things that pops up when you go to the website.
Also linked on Instagram.
Perfect. Yes. Well, Merlin, you are very busy. We really appreciate spending some time with you today and hearing your insight around the bat houses and all the great work that you're doing and continuing to do. So thank you so much for your time today.
Well, thank you, Jessica. We really appreciate all the good work that Bat B&B is doing, and
thank you.
Your many followers are all appreciated.
Well, this has been a really great partnership. We really appreciate it, Merlin. Thanks so much.
All right.
Bye.
Goodbye. Have a
good day.
You too.